We'll begin with a reading. The reading is from the book Big Magic, Creative Living Beyond Fear by Elizabeth Gilbert. Author Elizabeth Gilbert writes, "One of the best descriptions I've ever heard of the phenomenon of ideas entering and exiting the human consciousness at whim comes from the wonderful American poet Ruth Stone. I met Stone when she was nearly 90 years old, and she regaled me with stories about her extraordinary creative process. She told me that when she was a child growing up on a farm in rural Virginia, she would be out working in the fields when she would sometimes hear a poem coming toward her, hear it rushing across the landscape to her like a galloping horse. Whenever this happened, she knew exactly what she had to do next. She would run like hell toward the house, trying to stay ahead of the poem, hoping to get a piece of paper and pencil fast enough to catch it. And that way, when the poem reached her and passed through her, she would be able to grab it and take dictation, letting the words pour forth onto the page. Sometimes, however, she was too slow, and she couldn't get to the paper and pencil in time. At those instances, she could feel the poem rushing through her body and out the other side. It would be in her for a moment, seeking a response, and then it would be gone before she could grasp it. Galloping away across the earth, she said, searching for another poet. But sometimes, and this is the wildest part, she would nearly miss the poem, but not quite. She would just barely catch it, she explained, by the tail, like grabbing a tiger. Then she would almost physically pull the poem back into her with one hand, even as she was taking dictation with the other. And in these instances, the poem would appear on the page from the last word to the first, backward, but otherwise intact. Now that, my friends, is some freaky, old-timey, voodoo-style big magic right there. I believe in it, though. And there ends our reading for the day. If I may be allowed, I'd like to add a note to this reading. The Sunday Service Committee gave me 2 sermons to read, and I could choose one to present. So to help make a decision, I read them aloud to my wife, Nan, who, as some of you know, writes poetry. Very good poetry. And that's not just the opinion of a proud husband. When I read this passage, she exclaimed, "Oh my gosh, that happens. Sometimes it just comes out of nowhere and you have to write it down or it's gone." And then she gave me several examples and said, "You have to read this." And I have. So as Jeannie explained earlier, the author of our sermon today is the Reverend Janet Parsons, who was called to the Gloucester Unitarian Universalist Church in 2015, where she now serves as settled minister. And I found this interesting. It's located in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and this congregation is the first Universalist church in the United States, founded in 1779. And they meet in Gloucester's oldest standing meeting house. And it's a gorgeous meeting house. If you go online, if you find, this particular, they have a website, and there's some pictures of her and standing at the podium, and it's just a gorgeous building. So I found that interesting as I was looking up some things about her. And so now I present for you The Creative Spirit by the Reverend Janet Parsons. I once had the good fortune to be present when someone was struck by a creative spirit, and I had the chance to watch what happened. I was participating in a prayer group at my home congregation. I had never done anything like this before, but I was finding at the time that I was becoming more open to matters of the spirit more curious. So there was I, for the very first time, trying to explore prayer and its different forms, and frankly, working on figuring out who or what we might be praying to. And in the session on that particular day, the group had been given time to write, to explore writing a prayer or a reflection, to see what might emerge. And suddenly, a friend sitting next to me started writing as fast as he could, and sometimes almost visibly pouring out of him onto the paper. And as he scribbled, more and more of us noticed and began watching. At the end of the time, we were invited to share what we had written, and he read aloud his work. He titled it Horizons, and it began, "Surely it is one of the grandest illusions, that long, thin line where the earth appears to reach up and kiss the sky." People listened in amazement. And I remember another friend asking, "You mean you just wrote that now?" If this had never happened, I don't think I would have believed the story about Ruth Stone that I read a few moments ago. I mean, I come from a line of practical, logical folks who are pretty much interested in the facts. And I used to be one of them. And I would never have described myself as creative. I mean, my family tended to have a pretty limited definition of who could be considered creative. It involves famous artists and composers with names like Rembrandt and Beethoven and Van Gogh. So when a friend lent me Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, Creative Living Beyond Fear, I found that it really expanded my view of creativity and who gets to call themselves creative. If you're alive, you're a creative person, asserted Gilbert. And my word, I thought, that sets the bar low enough to include even me. So what is so wonderful about this is that it gives someone like me who never thought of myself as creative a chance to look at myself in a different way. What Gilbert attempted to do was to give everyone permission to see their own creativity, to open up possibilities, to step toward a life of curiosity, engagement, and courage. Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of the bestseller Eat, Pray, Love, has some very different ideas about the nature of creativity. She believes that our world is inhabited not only by beings, but by ideas. She believes that ideas are alive, that they have a conscious will, and that they actively seek a human collaborator in order to enable themselves to come to fruition. Creativity for her is a form of enchantment, something magical, mystical, supernatural. And I bet you don't hear something like that every day. I would not have believed this idea for a second if I hadn't once witnessed for myself someone sitting next to me who suddenly was just seized by some kind of creative force. But as I read the book and sat with Elizabeth Gilbert's ideas, I thought more about these notions that seem so otherworldly, so illogical. I started to remember times when it seemed that perhaps a channel had opened up for me, a door allowing something to emerge. I remember waking up very early one morning as a child and watching the sunrise and writing a poem about it. I remember snowshoeing a few years ago and meditating on color. How many shades of white and blue and gray could I identify in the shadows on the snow? When did one shade fade entirely into something else? And I remember how connected I felt, how aware, how completely engaged with my surroundings as I studied colors and shadows and angles of sunlight. Perhaps there is something to all of this. Perhaps I am a creative person, but I just hadn't noticed. Maybe I didn't have permission to notice. Perhaps I haven't known how to be open to the force that can emerge when I make room for it. Perhaps I've been confusing creativity with talent and not seeing many ways that the creative spirit is at work in my life. What Gilbert helps us to see is how deeply spiritual a creative life is. In fact, there's no way to separate creativity and spirituality. Creativity, the creative spirit, is what encourages people to grow, to find out more about themselves and the world, to be curious, to take risks, to love yourself and your work. The creative spirit is calling to us, hoping we will hear it, open to it and respond. It matures and develops our souls. This is the very essence of spirituality. What can separate us from a life of creativity isn't a lack of talent, whether we see ourselves or others see us as talented. No. What can separate us from a life of creativity is our response to the invitation, to the call. Do we say yes when we feel something inspiring us? Do we even notice? Do we walk through the door that opens, or do we say no, or I can't? To respond to the creative spirit, to notice when it's active, and to say yes requires courage and faith. It also requires hard work. There's an inherent paradox in creativity. We hear in our reading and in my story about these times when a swirl of ideas has just found someone seemingly naturally, without the person having to do much except hold a pencil. And that many of you know, I'm sure, that our response might begin with saying yes to the Spirit, but our response also requires hard work to make room for it, to nurture it. We grab the pencil and hold on, but paradoxically, we also have to keep learning and growing. Elizabeth Gilbert urges us not to quit our day jobs. Work and creativity are not separate. There's perseverance involved in creative life. There's commitment, not to wait until you have extra time. Commitment to arrange your life to make room for your creative spirit. We have to commit to weave the spirit, the ephemeral, with the mundane. We commit to balance, to honor all the conflicting needs and wants that human life demands us. But if we're committed to that weaving, that balance, we can live a life of spirit or creativity. Gilbert suggests that we treat our creativity like a lover. When we fall in love, we make the time. We are willing to sacrifice. I had never heard of the poet Ruth Stone, and so I did some reading about her. She had a difficult life. Following the suicide of her second husband, she raised 3 daughters alone, cobbling together a life as a visiting instructor at a number of colleges and universities. But throughout her long life, the poems continued to gallop across the fields to find her. Never keep a poem waiting, she told an interviewer once. It might be a really good one. If you don't get it down, it's lost. Ruth Stone finally gained tenure at a university in 1990 at the age of 75. And she was awarded the National Book Award at the age of 87. From Ruth Stone, a poet celebrated late in life, dies at 96, by William Grimes, New York Times, 2011. Quote, "Poetry coursed through her life," she said in her acceptance speech at the National Book Awards ceremony, "like a constant verbal stream above the thrum and buzz of everyday existence. It just talked to me and I wrote it down," she said, "so I can't even take much credit for it." Unquote. Ruth made it sound so simple. But when we look at the details of her life, we see that it was anything but simple. It took all of her long lifetime to be considered successful. There was the perseverance over 96 years of finding ways to create space to listen to the stream of poems. She kept saying yes to the creative spirit that was so present for her throughout her days. The creative life is not about easy success. It's about making room, allowing for possibilities, bringing forth what is within us. It's about nurturing our souls. It's about finding ways to live into the fullness of our lives, expressing ourselves, knowing ourselves, and allowing others to know us more completely. It's about wholeness and integrity, about trust, and about courage. All of these traits are examples of the fruits of the spiritual life. Without developing them, we cannot be whole. Deep within this concept of a creative spirit lies a paradox, and Elizabeth Gilbert describes it this way, quote, "Creativity is sacred and it is not sacred. What we make matters enormously and it doesn't matter at all. We toil alone and we are accompanied by spirits. We are terrified and we are brave. Art is a crushing chore and a wonderful privilege. Only when we are at our most playful can divinity finally get serious with us." I think that sentence bears repeating. Only when we are at our most playful can divinity finally get serious with us. Make space for all those paradoxes to be equally true inside your soul, and I promise you can make anything. Elizabeth Gilbert continued, "So please, calm down now and get back to work, okay? The treasures that are hidden inside you are hoping you will say yes." My hope for all of you today is that you will hear the permission to open yourselves to the life of spirit, a life of creativity, wherever it comes from, wherever it may take you. May you continue to say yes and bring forth whatever is within you. May it be so. Blessed be.